see the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.
Good morning, Scott McArthur here, and welcome to ARTEFACTLive, where we delve into the art and science of storytelling. Episode 42, Life, the Universe and Everything. I'm quite excited about this show because I've got someone on today, Rob Briner, who I've known for a few years. We met, Rob might remember, I think it was probably 5 or 6 years ago we met in a cafe in London to chat about things. And this guy's got opinions, and they're good opinions, and I really, really respect him. So I'm really looking forward to having that chat with Rob, but we'll get to that in a minute. Thanks very much for the feedback from last week's show, where we looked at goals and the importance or not of having goals when you're setting out to get a message across, to communicate, to tell a story with or without data. Interesting thoughts, and there was some arguments in the comments about whether goals were something we should even consider. And that's exactly the sort of thing I want to happen. I think I don't want us all agreeing with each other. So thanks very much for the contrarians. I appreciate you. It was fantastic. Other things that have been happening. Well, the market, from my perspective, seems to be moving, but it's still moving slowly. It's been a fantastic week in a sense that certainly some of the agencies I've been working with are now talking about live events again. How do I feel about that? I don't know, but well, I do know, but it's mixed. So it's been an interesting week, and I'll have a little bit more on that later on after I've spoken to Rob. So this week, evidence and storytelling. Well, this has been something. Well, the evidence part has been something that's been in my life for the best part of 30 years, and it's something that it's tied me in knots. It's confused me. It's excited me. It's stimulated me. It's annoyed me. I really have been through the mill with evidence, and whether it's evidence-based management, leadership, HR, OD, or indeed in the scientific domain, it's something that I've often fallen out with. It really has been the whole range of issues for me, evidence. And I know that my guest has got some strong thoughts on that. So I'll just bring Rob on. So here we go, Rob. I'll just click the wee button here. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Scott. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. I'm roasting hot. I'm
quite hot, yeah.
Oh, I'm in this little studio at the top of my house, and as you know, you get surrounded by lights. It makes it even worse. So if I start to look as if I'm dissolving, Rob, forgive me. Forgive me. So would you be good enough to give the viewers and listeners an introduction to what it is you do and what you're interested in?
Sure. So I'm an academic. I'm a Professor of Organisational Psychology at Queen Mary University of London. I'm also the scientific director and help set up something called the Centre for Evidence-Based Management. And one of my main interests, apart from areas around organisational psychology, organisational behaviour and human resource management, is about how practitioners can make better use of evidence in their decision-making, in their work, to try and make their work more effective.
Fantastic. So you're right in the sweet spot of what we're doing in this show. But let's talk about storytelling in that context. Where are you? What do you think about? Is there a role for storytelling in what you've just described? Do you think? Yeah.
Okay. I'm incredibly conflicted, as you said you were, about other things about this. Yeah. And in fact, overall, I think the urge and the instruction and the advice that we give to people. You've got your data, you've got your findings, you've got your research. And by the way, that's both in terms of being a researcher or a scientist or even an internal researcher, doing people analytics, being a policymaker. There's often a lot of emphasis on saying, tell a story with information. And the reason I think I'm very reluctant to that is that my experience of looking at data and evidence is that mostly it doesn't tell a very nice story. It is boring. It is inconsistent. There are null findings, and the desire to make it fit a story, I think, often ends up distorting the data, the evidence, the information you've got. So you've succeeded in making someone listen, but you've failed completely because you've given them the wrong or incorrect or very biased kind of data and information. So it's an odd kind of thing. And it's this distinction, I suppose, between, are you doing research, collecting information, collecting data, collecting evidence and sharing it just to persuade people of things? Or are you doing it to give people data and information they need to make better decisions? And for me, I'm in the latter camp. I'm not trying to convince people of a piece of data. I'm trying to, I guess, help them make better decisions for themselves.
Okay. I mean, I can't disagree with that. But can I go a step back? Because one of the things that I used to, when I had a proper job, when I was an HR director, I was probably, looking back on it, I was evangelical in terms of and I use that word with on advisement, but I was evangelical about evidence and asking, where's the evidence? But then I run into this is a huge subject, but we're not going to be able to get into all of this, but I then ran into this barrier, and it was basically bullshit. The whole of the HR function, it was called personnel when I started out. It wasn't even HR. I was a personnel officer. And it was all sugarly evidence, as they say in Scotland. It was anecdotal. It was poorly designed research instruments. It was non-experimental. It was there was no gold standard. It was a shambles. And therefore, I think and this is almost like therapy for me, Rob, because it was almost like I got so frustrated because the academics were no bloody use. It was all full of Taylorism and, and it was very difficult to get a hold of it. I don't know if that's changed. Obviously, you're at the sharp end in the academic world, but I hear a lot of talk about data in HR and in OD and in generally in industry. I'm still not convinced whether the data, it's just lots of anecdotes rather than data. I mean, I'm being very general there. I know I am. I apologize for that. But where are you with that? How do you think it's going in that respect?
It's a great question. I think for me, it's very important to make a distinction between whether you want to call it, and I know these are slightly different, but data, evidence, information, to make a distinction between what is there, what you've got, what you can see, the claim that is being made, and the extent to which the evidence, data, information, the claim match. So the kind of thing you're talking about around BS or around anecdotes. An anecdote is fine data if your aim is to tell a nice story and have a laugh with your mates. Anecdotes, perfect. Anecdotes around something very important where you're interested in cause and effect, you're making a general claim about a relationship between two things, or if I an intervention, anecdotes, not so good. So to me, I think it's very important to make a distinction between the data and the information that's around us and how much of it is really trustworthy and reliable, which should we pay attention to. And I think what I sense has happened, although there has been, as you say, in HR and many fields, including policy making, there's been, in a sense, an explosion of the data people can get, the information they can get. Is it better quality? I'm not so sure. So then what you do is a kind of signal and noise idea. You inundate people with more and more and more information, but in the end, they're not able to make better decisions because it's not necessarily better quality information or data.
I've been privileged to be involved in the Grenfell inquiry, and it's been fascinating. And one of the things that I've seen in that is that there is some, particularly, I have to be honest, I've been very impressed by the government policy people. They're not politicians. They're very good. They're very careful. But what the challenge is all about, it's intangible issues that's holding it back. And I don't think anyone would mind me saying that. It's about relationships. It's about egos. It's about power. Have you a view on that? Because I guess, sorry if I'm jumping about a bit, Rob, but there's so much in this. I think one of the realizations I came to, and I'm sort of qualifying my question, is that whilst my fetishization of data and my wish to be focused on that was true 20 years ago, maybe now, and I'm not certain of this, but maybe now I've almost gone the opposite way, because so many things are very, very difficult, if not impossible, to measure. And a lot of these things really matter. Have you a perspective on that? Or am I just talking nonsense?
Yeah.
And I'm prepared to accept I'm talking nonsense.
No, there's two things there. So one is, I think, about whether you can measure things. The second thing is about power. And I think it is the case that we are, all of us, embedded in wider systems and structures where people typically have more power than us and more authority than us, and often just want to do things. So a manager, a politician, whoever might decide, I want to do this. So I'm going to say I'm using evidence or whatever, but of course they'll cherry pick, and we all do this in our daily life. We cherry pick information data that fits what we already think is a good idea. So that is a challenge. And I think certainly when we're thinking about evidence, data and storytelling, it's often the case that people can tell those individuals who have that power, maybe they're quite charismatic, are very good at telling stories with data and information that's often quite unreliable and highly cherry picked, but they're very persuasive. So in a sense, maybe what you and I would want to do with evidence and data is not the same as what they would like to do, because they have perhaps an agenda about getting a specific thing in place for all kinds of other political reasons. Now, the other thing you said about lots of things can't be measured. Well, probably, but everything can be measured. The question is, again, can it be measured reliably and in a valid way? So you can measure anything you like. And I think I was having a discussion with someone a while ago, and they were saying, well, the things they do in their work, in an organization and with clients, they were saying it's completely unmeasurable. And I was saying, okay, so do you make any claims at all about the impact you have on other people, organizations? Yeah, sure I do. So what are those claims? And they told me what they thought their work did. And I said, well, in principle, you're saying I increased that, I improved this, I changed that, I reduced this. These are all quantifiable or quantified claims. You can either say, what I did in my job is so intangible, no one ever knows, including me, if it's have any effect on the world or people. Now, you can say that, but then again, that's a rather extraordinary claim. So I agree things are hard to measure, and they may not be measured particularly well, but the idea we can't measure stuff, I think is a bit, it's kind of a bit defeatist and also maybe a bit unethical. If we're claiming to have effects on other things, other people, we should at least be able to back up what we mean by that.
Because I mean, one of the things that often fascinates me is if you look at, and there is the Parkinson's law, where has there actually ever been any progress in industry as a consequence of information technology or data? You can put an argument together for no. You can put an argument together for yes, of course, but and the context is different and regulation is different. But I do wonder sometimes again, it's back to the fetishization. I know a lot of particularly HR professionals who are now, and you've probably got something to blame for this, are absolutely focused on data, but it's a disaster because they're measuring everything and achieving nothing. And I mean, that's not your fault, but they've fallen in maybe classic behavioral HR behavior. I don't know.
But also I'd say from an evidence-based practice perspective, whether that's medicine or policymaking or HR, simply only looking at one type and one source of data is not what evidence-based practice is about. So for example, in HR, if you only look at, say, people analytics, your organizational data, you're missing three other really important sources of information, which include scientific evidence, it includes stakeholder values and perspective, and include your own professional experience. So sure, you can look at this data, and I agree there's been a bit of a fetishization of people analytics, but if you don't take into account other sources of evidence, it's actually not necessarily particularly helpful. So I think again, this thing about using evidence and telling stories, I think people like to tell stories of their data and evidence, and often only looking at one source helps them do that, because they can tell a nice coherent narrative around something they've found, whether that source is science or stakeholders, organizational data, or even their experience. Looking across different sources of evidence and different types of evidence often, in my experience, quickly disrupts that nice, neat story that you're looking for. And I think that's why one of the reasons why people want to avoid that.
Yes, it reminds me of the sort of the cult of the guru. There is a lot of that still, and it's probably it's as big as it's always been. You know, it used to be the sort of the Alan Watts of this world, and now it's the Simon Sinek's of this world. You know, that they're very charismatic. But a lot of the work that they produce is perhaps borrowed from someone else, perhaps not well understood as it might be, and certainly not based on any experience. I love your. I mean, have you got a perspective on that, on the guru culture? Have you got?
Sure, yeah. And I think if you go right back to probably some of the earliest guru books, which will be things like How to Win Friends and Influence People, right? You know, up to In Search of Excellence, then books on lean management, and more recently books about whatever lean in or emotional intelligence. They all have something in common, of course, in that what they do is tell a nice, pretty tidy, interesting and exciting story by using very partial, often quite low quality data and information. But they're very persuasive. And I think that's almost, to me, one of the definitions of a management guru or a best-selling business book is it does that. People look at it and go, wow, isn't that amazing? And I think the issue is when you're looking at data and evidence, if you only want it to be wow and amazing, you're going to miss most data and evidence there, because to repeat, and I'll repeat it again if necessary, most data and evidence is not that exciting, but it is very important.
Yes. So how, I mean, I'm familiar with your model, the different ways you suggest, and you've mentioned it already, but I think if we could just re-emphasize that again. So if we've got data and it's been done, and this is a whole other conversation, but let's imagine in a perfect world, this is good data about a particular subject, and it's boring, but nevertheless, it's really important. So say, and this is not the reality, but say the Grenfell disaster that I did some work on, there is some data that suggests something. How do we then communicate that? Or when there's Peter on here just says something here about storytelling, you see it there. How do we then make that data have a value rather than because there's no point in it sitting in some obscure academic tome that's behind a paywall that no one can read.
And that's an important but slightly separate issue. I would, and I agree with you completely, but I would say the thing about if you've got a set of boring but important data, in order to communicate it, I think you have to go back to those individuals involved and ask them what are they trying to do in their work.
Right.
And if they truly believe that the boring important data is something they can ignore, there's an issue there about the way you've designed the job, maybe about the way you've selected them, about the way you've set up their incentives. An example might be if you want to get a train or catch a flight, when we can start catching flights and trains again more easily, you don't expect looking up the train time to be interesting.
No,
you're not there for entertainment. You're not going, oh my God, I'm trying to find out which train goes to. So boring. I'm not going to read it. You need that information. You're not after entertainment. And I think to me, it's the same for professionals, for jobs, for other contexts, for citizens. The question is, we shouldn't be looking for data to entertain us. Go to entertainment for that.
Yeah.
We should look for data to help inform us. And sometimes you may find it interesting. Sometimes you may not. That's not the issue. What are you trying to do? And how can you use the best available information to help you make a better decision, whether it's how you tackle COVID, whether it's which train you get. So I think it's moving away from that edutainment thing. And again, as I mentioned to you before, Scott, I think you see this in university teaching and training courses as well, where the trainer or teacher or lecturer or professor, particularly because of the way they're rewarded, is more interested in entertaining people maybe than educating them. So as a consequence, they tell great stories, they're very amusing, they're funny, they're entertaining. And so students come away feeling very positive about the experience. That's great. Did they learn very much? Possibly not.
Yeah.
I've
got Jordan Peterson going through my head at the moment, but let's not talk about him. He gets enough of your time. Can I be slightly contrary here? Because if you look at and I mean, I know something from my career, physics would not have got to the level that it's at in terms of public understanding, funding, representation, policy, if it hadn't been for Feynman, Sagan, Lewis, deGrasse Tyson. Without those, they were storytellers, all of them, and they. I mean, I personally think particularly Feynman and Sagan have fundamentally changed the landscape of everything to do with physics. So you're surely not saying that there's not a place for storytelling Are you? You're not. I know you're not.
No, I'm saying there's a place. It depends what you're trying to do. So if in your example, if you're saying we want to make physics accessible to people who otherwise wouldn't know anything about it, and we found a way to wrap this around a story or a narrative without distorting some of the fundamental things we're trying to communicate, the fundamental data and evidence or theory there, then of course there's a place for it. I guess my point is that often if you're not, one of the people who's extremely good at communicating in stories with using really good data, most of us tend to just want to tell a good story and we don't pay so much attention to the evidence and data. So sure, to attract someone to a subject, you may tell good stories. In a professional context or decision-making context, it should not be about selling them something. Unless you're a guru or unless you're a consultant, a certain kind of consultant, or snake oil salesperson, whatever. Then sure, your job is to make them buy something. But as a data collector, communicator, your job isn't to make them buy the information. No. And if they don't want to know it, as I say, and it's important for their job, that's something more fundamental to do with their job, their organization, the way the job's been set up, maybe their training, and say particularly their incentives. So for me, for example, in my experience of managers often, and I'd include academics in this as well, and other professionals, is that often we are incentivized to move away from what the evidence and data would tell us is effective. In other words, for example, we're rewarded for doing stuff. We're rewarding for hitting targets. We're not rewarded necessarily for being effective. And if we're not, why would we be interested in data? So I could look at data, say, about how in my one part of my job, which is teaching, how do students learn? Do students learn through lectures? Not really. A lecture is a good way of teaching people, not so much. But nonetheless, I'm required to do lectures, and the ratings I get from my lectures may impact at some point in my performance appraisal or pay or something else, even though we know that those ratings are both biased, not against me, but against other groups. And also we know that often, it seems to be the case that the higher ratings you get, the less students learn. So it's just a tiny example. I think anybody in their professional life can probably think of ways in which they're incentivized and rewarded for not necessarily doing what's effective. And that means you have no incentive to be interested in the evidence and data that will help you be more effective, because that's not really what you're being paid for. And it's quite a paradox. And again, this applies, I don't know who's listening, whether it's, a police officer or a nurse or a policymaker. Everyone's got examples of this. I would like to do this job better, but actually I'm just being told to hit targets. It's a common point.
That is a really interesting and it's nuanced, but with a hammer on top of it. I mean, I remember I almost lost a job once. I was HR director in the food industry in one of the big companies. It was a £5 billion company. And I raised an issue about the efficacy of performance management. And it was the old fashioned, manager scores, they put a bell curve on you and you get congratulations, you're average. That was the experience of most people in the organization. And I questioned that and said, well, is that really motivating our people? And the chief executive got really cross with me because he saw it as a way of motivating his stars. And we had a long discussion and a pretty big fallout actually over, what is the best way to do it. Now, we don't need to go into that just now, but certainly that was my experience. And it started, I think that was one of the moments that I got to that conflicted perspective, Rob, because, I was looking for evidence, but it just wasn't there, and the company, and this is, I'd like your view on this actually. Do companies have the appetite to create good data? Do they actually have the time or the appetite or the money to create good data?
Well, I think that's a good question. I think it depends. If you're talking about, say, the oil and gas or airlines, the answer would be yes. Because there's very safety critical organizations where getting something wrong has huge consequences. I think in other sectors and industries, maybe it's not seen as quite so important. And I think this is one reason why I think using evidence and data and trying to use it more in your job, in your organization, it's quite a good way of finding out, do we have access to the stuff? So typically, even for example, within HR, people might have huge employee databases with all kinds of data in there. Once they try and use it, they find maybe it's not very usable, or a lot of the stuff is not very relevant, or people have just been ticking the same boxes in their performance appraisal, whatever it is. And they look at it and go, well, actually, This is useless. We've got a lot of it, but it's not very useful. So I think, again, there may be an appetite for it, either where the risks of failure are very high or the cost of failure is very high. And also, I think where people better understand how, not having good data is not very useful. So it's a kind of, I would say it's a kind of investment. Are you prepared to spend time developing systems to give people access to that knowledge or not? Right. To your point about paywalls and academic scientific literature being paywalled, it's a really clear example of a major issue. If individuals have to struggle so much to read a journal article that's relevant to their professional field, and even once they've paid $30 to read it, it's gobbledygook to them, they're just not going to use it. So I think there's issues about who's responsible for this, whose job is it to pull together data and information from different sources in a way that's usable for decision makers. And the problem is the responsibility seems to not quite land anywhere. So that's why you might need someone whose job it is to be, in charge of maybe evidence, or the evidence curator, or someone who actually tries to pull it together, and that's their job in an organization, which I think would make a lot of sense to me. But you would need to commit to it. So is there appetite there? I think sometimes it depends, but often not so much. And again, if my success in my job does not depend on how effective I am, then I'm not going to care. Yes. Just not going to care.
And really, the idea of someone responsible for evidence or data in an organization is an interesting one, because certainly from our domain where we both work in terms of the HR and OD space, the thought of it being the HR person, and I'm talking very generally here, it's almost comedic, because it used to be the HR person was the last person who understood data. I mean, they were at the bottom of the day. They didn't have that competence, and they still aren't trained to have that competence. It's not top of the list. But I love the idea of having someone. But then they would then have to have an interesting mix of links with internal and external data sources, wouldn't they? It would be really interesting that.
They would. And the idea is so whether they were working with, HR, the IT department, finance, whatever it was, the idea, I guess, is they'd be relatively agnostic or neutral. They wouldn't go into it thinking, oh, this piece of software is the best, therefore we should buy it, or this way of doing our finance is the best, or this way of whatever of doing performance. They wouldn't have a view. And their point is to not have a view, which is try and pull together the evidence that's there.
Okay. Right, I'll park that for a minute. We'll come back to it. But there's a couple of questions here, or observations that we're about halfway through. So if you don't mind, here's a comment from Andy Curry. Rob, evidence and data is meaningless unless it's part of a whole methodology. What do you think about that?
I'm not quite sure what that means. I think if you mean you can't just look at a piece of data on its own and do something with it, I agree. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Yes.
And I think there's another comment before about tacit knowledge.
Yes, from
stories
Peter.
Being good for that. Yeah. So I'd agree that storytelling can transfer a lot of knowledge and information. That's not a question here. And that I would count that as data in a sense, but it depends on what you're trying to communicate. So for example, if you tell stories that are based on reliable data and tell people this is how you do things, this is how you learn, and it's incorrect, it's not particularly helpful. So I agree it's a good way of communicating, but it still depends on the quality of the evidence data behind that story you're telling. If it's good and you're not distorting it through your story, then of course I completely agree.
Yes. And I've got an observation here from Doug. Back to the topic of method by which the data is given, is there an argument that data needs to be made interesting in some situations? What about school students, where they have to be in school and absorb data on a daily basis with only the hope?
Well, you could argue, Doug, that is the whole problem with the education system.
Yes.
That actually maybe we should be being aware of why aren't people interested in this, or what does that mean, and why do we try and make it interesting? But I agree, there's a sense in which, in terms of teaching maybe kids or the kind of things, you have to structure the learning in a way that might engage them in some way. But that's not necessarily the same as telling stories that distort. So, for example, you wouldn't try and describe something about the solar system to kids by saying, I don't know, dinosaurs moved all the planets around. Now, that's going to be a much more interesting story. But you might want to do that. You might want to talk about how it works in a different way. But I agree, getting people interested is one thing. Telling a story that distorts what seems to be reliable is something else. But I agree. Yeah.
And there's another comment. I'm sorry, I can't see your name from LinkedIn, but it says data and staff surveys. There's an interesting topic in itself. I had the experience that data is poured over, yet the personal comments was graffiti and ignored.
I think that can happen. I think it partly happens because people, it seems to me, often necessarily see quantified qualitative data, which after all is what a survey is. As soon as you get a number, people think it's more relevant and reliable and useful, which of course is not the case at all. A lot of surveys can be pretty poor quality and tell you very, very little. I think the personal comment stuff, I think people find it harder to process and analyze. So people, you're right, I think will pour over hundreds of pages of crosstabs of kind of responses to things, and actually I'm not sure how, or try and get insight from it. And it may be some of the comments that people have made are actually much more insightful. And again, it goes back to what is that decision maker trying to do? And I think staff surveys is a great idea in that you collect information and data, and often no one knows what they're for. A question I often say to when I'm particularly, for example, in this case, work with HR, and you can apply it across the board to lots of areas. You can say, what would happen if you stopped collecting those data? What would happen if you stopped doing the survey? And normally the answer is, well, we wouldn't have any data from the survey. Okay. So what? Why does that matter? What would happen if you didn't do that? And then it's often quite a puzzle. Yeah, why are we doing this? So sometimes collection of data and evidence becomes a kind of ritual that doesn't feed into helping people be more effective in their work. It's just more data and information. And I put with things like net promoter score as an example, other data you can collect about your customers and clients. Some of that might be useful. A lot of it, I'd say, is not particularly useful at all, and it's fairly unusable. But it takes up a lot of time of staff looking at those kind of data like net promoter score, and a lot of kind of trying to work out why it's low. Not, well, does it matter if it's low, and what does it mean, or so what, or suppose we didn't even know this. Could we give better service by not having this information and getting some other? Maybe you could. So it also can be kind of distracting. So I think I quite like that example from LinkedIn user. Yeah, I think, it's a good example of collecting evidence almost for its own sake because you hope it will help you. But actually, unless you know what you're trying to do, it won't necessarily. Yeah.
So, I mean, we're already at 35 minutes. I can't believe that. If you had the opportunity to walk into an organization, a new organization, say it had a medium size, like 1,000 people in the business, and it doesn't matter if it's doing a service or a product at the moment, how would you set it up? How would you suggest that they set it up to get the best value from the data and therefore, and also the communication of that data? I mean, what would be the model that you would think there'd be some chance of it working? Yeah, I'm trying to be careful with my words here, but what would you like? What would it look like? Give us some OD consulting here.
Okay, so I think the first thing, and this is very obvious, but I think you need to sort of say, what is this organization for? What is it trying to do? And can you tangibly say what it's for, what it's trying to do? And can you not only measure in terms of numbers, but can you assess it in some way? What is it for? What is it trying to do? How do you know if it was doing that thing that you think it's supposed to do? Once you've got that, then you can start thinking in terms of, I think maybe it's what I forgot his name meant about having a methodology. Then you need to start thinking about what are the things we can do that will affect these outcomes that are important, we think are important for us. And then actually having a sort of model of change or some sort of logic model that suggests what you need to do to get to that point. And I would say the main way I think of getting people to do it is to constantly get people to focus on what their role is, what the organization's role is, and keep asking questions like, is this important? What am I trying to do? What am I trying to achieve? And if that's fairly clear, what I'm trying to do, what is most likely to do that? So I think a lot of questioning, a lot of revisiting, and actually making it, it's hard to say, obviously it's an obvious thing, but making it normal to ask questions like why. I think we've all had the experience of sitting in meetings, and sometimes we want to ask why, or sometimes other people want to ask why. And after 3 or 4 whys, sometimes it feels annoying, or you're aware you're annoying other people.
Yes.
And if you're doing the whys, you're thinking, but isn't this okay to ask this question? And apparently it isn't.
It isn't. Yes.
So does that something, at what point is it, it's okay to ask those questions, because if you don't, I'm not asked to ask those questions, if you're not clear about what you're trying to do, if you're not clear about how you can get there, then again, being interested in data and evidence information is going to be a long way away from your agenda, because you're just hitting targets and doing what you're told, in effect, I guess.
Yes.
So I think it's quite possible to do it, but I think you probably also need to get the 4 sources of evidence I mentioned. I think you need to give people the idea that not one is better than the other. It depends on the question, asking good questions, all those kinds of sort of critical thinking skills as well, I guess.
Yes. Could you just repeat the 4 areas that you're
Sure. So one is the one we talked about a few times, which is, I guess, people analytics in the organizational data from the organization itself, if it's a national level thing. It might be the country itself, data you collect from the context. Then there's professional expertise. So as a practitioner, whether it's policing or policy making, what do you think as a practitioner? What's your experience telling you? Then it's stakeholders, values and concerns. And again, that's typically, say, employees, or it could be citizens, or it could be senior management, it could be politicians. These are stakeholders in decision. Then the other area is scientific evidence. So there's at least kind of these four areas where you look into each one with your questions, and you try and pull out relevant and good quality information that might help you answer that question. And it's partly about triangulation, that you check to see if you're getting the same thing. But I think equally importantly, it's about contextualization. So for example, sometimes people might use scientific evidence. There may be some quite high quality, well-conducted studies, and they try and apply it in a context without getting any other data. Now, you don't know whether or not the evidence from one source, which is the scientific evidence, actually is going to work in your context and may be counterproductive unless you have evidence and data from those 3 other sources: your experience, organizational data, what do your stakeholders think? Because you might find out really quickly, although this scientific evidence in and of itself is high quality, it is not going to help us here.
Yes, I've seen that. I've seen that often with companies who rely very heavily on benchmarking.
Yes, exactly. They
get lost because they haven't thought about context. That's a really interesting observation, and I have to say, Rob, I love your idea there, the 4 different aspects. I know you've written a lot about it, and I'll point people towards that. But can I just read another? It's a long one, so I won't put it on the screen. But it's what the point that Blake has made. Blake Jelly, thanks for commenting, Blake. Interesting discussion. Stories can be memorable and share actionable steps. Rob has made me realise that when linking to data and evidence-based practice, it might be better to think about fables so that the lesson or moral of the story is not lost in an effort to entertain.
Yes, that's right. A sort of more sobering kind of, yes, indeed. So you might say, and this is it. I think this is the interesting thing about these narratives. Even if you take scientific articles, they also tend to follow this storytelling narrative structure. So typically they might say, oh, there's this really important question or topic. These researchers found this. These researchers found that. Oh my God, it's quite contradictory. But you know what? Those researchers did not think about this other variable, this other thing. And we are going to measure that. And look, we measured it. And look what happened when we did that. We found out why it was so contradictory. Ta-da! Here's the answer. Now, this is a good example of storytelling where I think often researchers are sort of distorting, trying to tell a nice story about something to get it published. Now, if they did that whole thing and said, you know what we found is this thing we discovered, or the thing we included, it made absolutely no difference. It's actually quite hard to get that stuff published. So as Blake said, maybe it's more a fable. It's as in, you know what, we didn't find that. It's not a very interesting story. It's not as fun as, ta-da, we found the answer. But it might be more instructive. Yes, it's a good point to think of that there are different kinds of stories with different endings. And some of those stories is, you know what, didn't work. We don't know. That's the end of the story. And I was thinking about narratives and stories. I was thinking about plays and things. I was thinking about Samuel Beckett and Waiting for Godot. And I think, for me, when I sometimes sort of listen to that kind of drama where it actually is not at all sort of traditional narrative, sometimes to me that's what data is. Maybe it's just me. Sometimes to me that's what data and evidence is like. There's not a neat story. What there is sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's weird, sometimes it's boring, sometimes it's confusing, and that's the way I experience often a lot of data information, rather than being a nice, happy, nice story with a clear ending. Thank you.
There's a lovely comment here from Graham Rose about Ebola, but we'll come back to that, Graham, in a minute, because I quite like to have a go at that between us. Final main issue that I wanted to ask you about, is there an example of, somewhere we could look up to, something that you think they do it really well, and given the context discussion we've already had, it's got caveats on it, that's fine. So is there an example? And the secondary part of the question is, are we just talking nonsense here? Is it all utopian? If you get thousands of people in an organization, it's never going to work. It's all about money. It's a load of bullshit. It's just companies. I mean, it's like the word engagement, meaningless, but it's everywhere. NLP, pretty meaningless, but it's everywhere. There's all these fads, all nonsense. Are we just wasting our time? So the first part was, and I know I'm being contentious, but first part was, is there somewhere to look that you could suggest to our viewers and listeners that, there's a rich vein, or it looks like there could be things here that you could really learn from?
Okay, so I'll do the second part first. I don't know, and if I did know, I might just be trying to tell a nice story. So I'll probably resist it. I can think about that and get back to you. The second thing you said was quite interesting. You said, look, is it all just about the money? Is it all just about the money? It's not about... Well, what's interesting is if you really are all about the money, then you really want to pay a lot of attention to data and evidence. And what strikes me about organizations is they often claim a financial or economic imperative, but when you look at what they do, you think, well, actually, it's not the main motivation. You're doing this thing, say it's employee engagement, because you think it's cool. Yeah. You're doing this thing because everyone else is doing it. If you were really interested in financial bottom line, you wouldn't do that because you pay more attention. So what's interesting? So people often say to me, same kind of question you're asking, why would people do this? All they're interested in money. Well, if you are, great, then you should be interested in evidence as well, because you have a very particular kind of outcome you're interested in. If you have other outcomes, like I want to get promoted, I want to create an empire in this organization that's going to give me a lot of power, fine, then do other stuff. Yes. But even that, some evidence might help, I guess, apart from if you're just very charismatic or something. So I think I don't have a good example, but I think, it depends. It does depend what you're interested in, how you want to do it, for sure. Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the sort of, and you got to be careful with your words, but some of the tidal waves that hit organizations that they haven't predicted, like COVID's a good example. But for example, in LinkedIn at the moment, there's virtually every post is about racism or D&I, or it's a whole thing at the moment, and companies are responding to that. Goodness knows what they were doing 25 years ago when this all started, but they're responding again to that, and so they should be. But that, to me, I think it's a good example, because a lot of those organizations, it's a fear of the public coming down on them, which I think will happen to some companies. And whether or not, I don't know if that's is that a bit evidence? I mean, look at Witherspoon. I mean, there's an argument that
I think it's about prioritizing action over evidence.
Right. Okay.
It's about saying, it's the old, we need to do something. This is something. Let's do it. So it's prioritizing doing stuff over trying to really understand what the issue or problem is. I did a post on LinkedIn and Twitter a while ago. because I read an article about COVID hygiene theatre.
Yeah.
And this is based on, I don't know if it was original, but it's based on the idea that after 9/11, as some people remember, lots of new airport security measures introduced, and somebody described these as security theatre. So the little bottles, a lot, maybe some of the things made a difference. A lot of the things kind of did not. So I guess you could look at things. I would include D&I, for example, EDI in that to some extent. They are theatre. They are saying, look at us. We are doing stuff. We're trying to look at me. I'm washing my hands. Yes. Even though compared to other things, it doesn't make much difference. But I'm going to do all this stuff. We're going to throw everything at it. And again, the problem with that is not only is it to some extent ignoring the data and evidence, also it's very distracting. So it's been argued in the case of COVID, for example, because people are told to wash their hands, even though we know, my understanding is the major transmission is aerosol spray. It's not foam, whatever it's called. Yeah. It's fine to ask people to wash their hands. People say it does no harm. The argument is it does do harm because it distracts people from the most important thing, which is aerosol transmission. So sure, you can do loads of D&I, whatever it is, stuff, or things around mental health, all those things where people feel they need to do something. But actually, if some of it's irrelevant or not working, in the end, it's actually harming what you're trying to do.
Yes.
So I think one way of thinking about those activities, I think they are linked to evidence and data in that, I say they're prioritizing doing stuff and doing lots of stuff over what actually is the issue, the problem, the opportunity here. What is the evidence for that? And once we're reasonably clear about that, what is the evidence and data about what is the most likely solution or intervention to help us with that? Or those steps are kind of missed out and things are done.
Yes, very interesting. Okay, well, look, this discussion is absolutely fascinating, but we're going to have to draw towards the end now. We're over time now. But let me just ask you Graham's asked this question. If Ebola landed in the UK 10 years ago with Oxford immunology developments, would there now be a cure? Ha!
I don't know. I don't know.
Let me respond to that in a way, Graham, because it's a bit like one of the misunderstandings here is about complexity. There has been more money, and many argue disproportionately more money put into HIV research in the last 20 years. Careers in immunology and virology have been destroyed because of money going into one area because it was very focused. And it's important, but they still haven't found a cure. They've found a way of managing it, but they haven't found a cure. And the reason for that is it doesn't matter how much money you throw at certain things. It's not about money. It's about complexity. However, in other things like COVID, which is simple, doesn't mutate as much, money had a significant part to play and is getting to these, the current jabs or jags, as we call them in Scotland. So, but it's a very complex area. So I don't know either about Ebola. Ebola is complex. I think it's a lot more complex than COVID. So it wouldn't matter how much money you threw at it. You'd maybe speed up the process, but it would still take decades, as it has with the common cold and HIV. That would be a very pseudoscience-y, so that's not pseudoscience, it's a real sciencey response to that. Let me, there's a couple of other things we can just do before we finish here. Here's some of the, Amazon have it down to a fine art money, the money motive, appealing to dopamine rush with others who bought X also buy Y. Yeah, I don't know if I can argue with that.
Dopamine rush may or may not be the mechanism, but yes.
Yeah.
Like the next comment, the washing hands are significantly reduced flu infections. Yes, I mean, that may be the case. But the question is, what are we trying to do?
Yeah.
The instructions to wash hands wasn't given at least a year and a half ago to reduce flu. Now, you're right. An accidental, possibly good side effect has been it's reduced that. But what's the cost of that? If the cost is people not realizing the air transmission thing as clearly or as cleanly as they would, then maybe it hasn't helped. Great, it's had that accidental effect, but was that really what we were trying to do? So I take your point, but I still would argue it's maybe diluted the message a bit.
Yeah, and distracted some of the PR around it as well, I suspect. But that's probably a policy matter. Well, Rob, that has been a fantastic conversation. I knew it would be, and it was. And it's now evidence-based because people can rewatch this on replay. So if people want to look at more of your work or read more of your work, where would be the best places for people to go to have a look, Rob, please?
Yeah, I've got a sufficiently unusual name, but if you just Google Rob Briner, you'll probably find my Queen Mary page and www.robbriner.com because it's just say sufficiently unusual. So yeah, you can find things probably robbriner.com is the best thing to find most things. Yeah. Okay.
Well, I'm sure you'll get some traffic to have a look at that, and I will also put some in the comments, the links rather on the video when it comes out. Rob, thank you ever so much for joining.
Well, thank you.
Absolute pleasure. That was the fastest 50 minutes I think I've had on the show. So thanks ever so much, and I hope we can speak again because I suspect there's a lot more we could have a very
good be delighted. Thanks, Scott. Thank you.
Thank you. So I hope everybody enjoyed that as much as I did. You could probably see the little boy coming out in me there because it's a bit like a sweetie shop for me talking to someone as expert as Rob and how interesting his perspectives are. And I hope you go away thoughtful. And I think Rob's point about being questioning and asking the why question is something that I would love to hope that we could encourage people to do more of as a consequence of this. So just thanks again, Rob. That was absolutely fantastic. Next week, I've got a plan. However, I'm not going to tell you yet because it's one of those plans that might not work. So I'm going to keep it to myself at the moment. But nevertheless, if it comes off, it's a cracker. And I hope you find it interesting when we get there. A couple of books just to recommend to you on this front. One behind me here. I've spoken many times about Nancy Duarte's work. And this is her book about data story and how to communicate data effectively. Now, as Rob said, you know, you need to be careful and make sure it's good data, it's valuable data, and you've got to remember the context. But Nancy Jarty's work is very helpful in that perspective. So thank you ever so much for everybody for tuning in. It's been great, and I really, really liked the level of interaction this week, folks. Thanks very much. Rob, Doug's just saying, really interesting chat. We'd love to hear another one in the future. Thank you. Thanks very much for the feedback, Doug. That's really very much appreciated. Remember, when you leave this today, look out for your own stories, because you know what, guys? Those stories might change the world. And I believe at the moment that it's something that we should be thinking more and more about. And I hope you enjoyed it. See you next week. Thanks very much. My name is Scott McArthur. You've been watching and listening to Artefact Live, the art and science of storytelling.